Avoid empty talk. That's the message from the Chinese president as he hosts world leaders for the G20 summit. China's trying to sell its own vision on how to shape the global economy. But will other countries buy that vision? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It accounts for 2/3 of the world's population and 80% of the global economy. So it's fitting that members of the G20 would focus this year's summit on developing what they call an interconnected and inclusive world economy. As this year's host, China says that it hopes to transform the summit from a crisis response system to a long-term governance body. But is the country ready to set the agenda and to lead the world at a conference of this size? We'll get to our guest in just a moment. But first, Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown sets up the story from Hangzhou, where the leaders are meeting.
China does this sort of thing well. The welcoming ceremony, a reflection of the grandeur and lavish spending for this summit. In China, there is powerful symbolism in the world's top leaders walking across a red carpet to be greeted by Xi Jinping. These men and women represent 2/3 of the world's population and 80% of its economy. All gatherings, says one expert, during its most critical period since the end of the Cold War 27 years ago.
All of these G20 leaders, their starting point is that they're scared. And they know not one of them can escape unless they pull together to get it all right.
There are new faces here. Britain's Prime Minister, Theresa May, and Brazil's Michel Temer, who only officially took over as president less than a week ago. But it'll also be President Barack Obama's last G20. So he's also saying farewell here.
This is my last G20, Theresa's first, but the continuity of the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, that stretches back many decades, and it will continue for many decades to come.
The Chinese government has another task here to reassure the G20 leaders that China's economy is not heading for a hard landing, as had been the fear just 6 months ago. The European Commission President treated President Xi like an old friend, but earlier had harsh words about overproduction in China's steel industry, which is hurting Europe's producers.
We want to make sure they respect basic principles and the high standards that European citizens expect from us. Free trade must be fair trade.
China is waving the flag for free trade here, but all at a time when global growth stagnates and protectionist policies become more popular among many of the countries represented here. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Hangzhou.
Well, China's economy has slowed over the past few years, but it's still one of the largest in the world, second only to the United States, whose economy is nearly double that of China's. And compared to the other biggest G20 economies, the US and China are well ahead. Let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Beijing, we're joined by Einar Tangen. He's an economic affairs commentator and an advisor to the Chinese government on economic issues. And from London, we're joined by Anastasia Nesvetailova, who's the director of City Political Economy Research Centre at the City University in London. Welcome to you both. Einar, if we start with you first, to what extent is China in the driving seat as far as G20 economic policy is concerned? Are the days when the US set the tone coming to an end, do you think?
I mean, it's an excellent point, but I think you have to kind of pull back a little bit and understand that the way that China is trying to steer things is not the same way that it was done in the U.S. In the U.S., we look at things from a legalistic Westphalian state kind of perspective. But for China, it's a civilization state, and it's driven by consensus. So what you're seeing emerging here in the G20 is this consensus idea that we will go forward together or we will not go forward at all. And that leadership will not be through rules and impositions, but more likely, more definitely through this idea of how consensus.
All right, so we'll talk more about consensus a little later in the program, but China sees this G20 meeting then as a chance to grow its reputation as a global leader in shaping economic discussion.
I don't know that it's about reputation necessarily. I think earlier when Adrian said that this is about desperation, I think that's more to the point. You have the major advanced economies sliding sideways. Right now, all the progress that's been made since the major meltdown 2008, 2009 has been driven by the Asian economies. These are the emerging economies, and behind them you have the developing economies. They are now a much, much stronger voice than the days when the G7 was dictating economic terms. Now it's a much more broadly based situation, and I think China is simply trying to get on with it. They have a very ambitious plan for their One Belt and One Road program. They've developed institutions like the AIIB, but in order to get it done, they have to have a political and economic landscape that is not going to turn towards protectionism, xenophobia, and fearful.
We'll address a lot of those issues, in particular the AIIB as well, in a few moments. Anastasia, China then rising economically, but the US is still the world's economic superpower. But for how much longer?
I would suggest for quite some time, although the process of negotiating these two new centers of power, or the new center of power and the old center of power, will be difficult sometimes. It's a question of really resources and vision, and although I agree with Einar that China certainly has all the economic resources at its disposal, and it has been deploying them quite efficiently over the past 2 decades in capturing new markets and feeding its own domestic economic model, I'm not sure as an aspiring world hegemon, it has the vision and strategy to offer an alternative to Western-dominated world order, flawed, but an order that had been built through decades by consistent effort that is underpinned by institutions, paradigms, and quite a coherent economic vision. It can be a flawed vision, and it worked for capital rather than people in many places, but it is a coherent framework. I'm not sure China can offer that at the moment as yet.
We'll come to that framework and the institutions in just a moment, but China wants the world economy to become more innovative, invigorated, interconnected and inclusive. Do the other G20 members share that vision?
Of course, rhetorically, everybody who wouldn't want an economy to be innovative, fast-growing, efficient, inclusive. No political leader would not sign such a proposal. The question is of method, of resources and ability. So I think there will be a lot of consensus building or consensus appearing rhetoric coming out of the G20 summit. And it can be that, due to urgency that Einar pointed out, that some communique will be drafted. But in terms of actual implementation of an alternative or a better way forward out of the current crisis, I think it will be some time. There will be very practical solutions to some problems, but in terms of long-term strategy, it is yet to be developed.
Okay, so let's look at this issue of consensus then. Einar, China seems to be pushing this idea of decision-making by consensus. Is that born out of frustration with the current world order, the way in which economic policy is currently drawn up?
I think it's the realities of a multipolar world. We've moved away from the monopolar U.S. model, and as a result, there's really no other way to do it. I mean, I'll give you a good example. The situation in the South China Seas. I mean, this was an imposed idea that was hatched up by 5 people sitting in The Hague. It was not accepted. There's no enforcement mechanism. You cannot have a rule of law if there is no way to enforce it. So therefore, going forward, given that there are many, many parties to this, it will have to be based on some sort of consensus. And we already have seen this. You see this operating in ASEAN. ASEAN is a consensus body. There's no going forward unless everybody signs on. Now, it can be frustrating. It takes a lot more time, definitely a lot more time, but it's probably the only realistic way forward as given modern times.
Anastasia, though, critics will say you never get anything done by consensus. We heard Einar talking about the frustrations at ASEAN there. Are they right?
Yes and no. I think it's a question of two alternative approaches to making things done or to global order. One is about legal rules, legality, and the idea that nobody is above the law, including the president or prime minister. And another is more, again, pragmatic, very practically oriented problem-solving, consensus building, where the idea is not about the contract, but the very agreement or relationship that the parties have with each other, very prevalent in Asia. I think consensus can work for certain, especially short-term goals when urgent matter needs to be addressed, an earthquake, an economic crisis, a financial malaise. But in the long term, when you talk about a very complex body of society, politics, governance mechanism, and the economy, I think some understanding of contractual responsibility, of that rule of law and how it applies and is governed, and who is accountable and to whom, those are very important issues. And the West, so far, is the only model that can provide some coherent answers to how it works.
It's not another way of saying that China will look as the dominant player, the biggest economy. It's not China saying they'll look to bring others around to its point of view, is it?
They have, I would say, they have been quite successful in using that particular approach, and usually advocating their own interests. They're very shrewd negotiators. But in terms of being present on the world stage and efficient on the world stage as a world leader, China is still constrained with the architecture that was laid in place after the Second World War. And that architecture is really about very coherent Western-oriented idea of liberal economy, capitalism, democracy, and accountability, liberal institutionalism, if you want. China is present in all those institutions, and it is constrained by those rules itself. So although it's already a very powerful player and an aspiring power, it has to negotiate the existing constraints, and if it wants an alternative consensus-building approach to world order, it needs to provide an institutional and paradigmatic framework, if you want an ideology of what this alternative framework would be.
I know one of China's priorities during this summit is to discuss reform of global governance bodies, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, various regional development banks. Do the other G20 nations share its appetite for reform? What are the problems? You touched upon them a little earlier. Outline the problems of those organizations for us.
Well, I mean, part of it is ideological, part of it is political. From the U.S. point of view, it's been the main stumbling block. We have not been willing to sign off on changing the structure to accommodate China or any other developed nations. We basically have just been holding the power there. This has caused a lot of frustration within the bank and the IMF, World Bank and IMF, who have repeatedly said we need to get this going, otherwise time will pass us by. In terms of the kind of institutions that we're talking about, that Anastasia was talking about, I completely agree. But we have to resist the idea that China is an aspiring hegemon. We tend to think of things in terms of our own history. And if you start looking at backwards at how things are generally handled in the East, apart from bloody wars and conflicts, it generally does have to be some sort of consensus building around that. So it's really important that we don't look at that. I think China is pushing an alternate model, both economically and politically, and that's why this is the first step in a long journey which they hope will lead to a coherent governing body, something to take over where the Bretton Woods, World Bank, IMF, and others have kind of left off.
Anastasia, do you agree with that? What's wrong with the Bretton Woods institutions?
Oh, many things. In some ways, these institutions that are programmed to thrive on failure of others, their crisis addressing mechanisms, and they quite unequivocally represent the interest of the West, the interest of capital, the interest of more developed nations against the emerging or developing economies. So there are many things wrong with this architecture, and again, this current crisis or the slowdown in the world economy is only an example of how all those structural and institutional imbalances hadn't been addressed historically. But at the same time, I would say that one difference between the, again, Chinese version of multilateralism and unipolar world as represented by the Bretton Woods sisters is that the existing institutions, WTO, the IMF, World Bank, essentially they represent a certain extension of what national capitalisms of the member states, of the initial founding states are. Again, institutions of accountability, market capitalism, democracy, elections, centrality of the human being, of human rights and human life. China doesn't have that apparatus. It operates on a very different, more authoritarian principle of rule, and although there is some accountability within the Communist Party apparatus, really it's quite far away from, you know, wide participatory democracy that is replicated in existing institutions. So how to navigate this tension and how to arrive at a different version of world order that would be appealing to all other emerging markets. We have seen with BRICS, for example, over the past decade, that several big emerging economies tried to form their own institution, their own regional partnerships, but so far it's been quite slow and not particularly articulate. There are more diversity to BRICS economies, including, you know, China, Brazil, India, and Russia, than coherence. So I think I would agree that it's a first step, but a first and relatively small step in a very long and difficult process.
I know. What do you make of what you just heard there? Is it going to be a difficult process?
Absolutely. I mean, gaining acceptance for this kind of shift, not only in political and economic terms, but also in cultural terms, is very, very difficult. I mean, it's not only that you have this kind of Western dominated ideology about how people act and why they act. You have so many assumptions that go with the kind of ideology of Western liberal democracy. The whole Francis Fukuyama end of time, all these types of things. I think people have to rejig their thinking. We're going through this kind of paradigm shift where people say, okay, what did work no longer works. We need to find something new. So yes, there will always be a criticism of China that when you're exploring new area, you are literally crossing the stream by feeling the rocks because you really don't have a roadmap. So I agree with Anastasia on that. It is going to be a very difficult transition. But once again, what are the alternatives?
Right at the beginning of the program, you mentioned the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Why did China set that up, Einar? Was it to directly compete with the Asian Development Bank, which of course is run largely out of Washington and Tokyo?
No, after years of lobbying to be increased, I mean, they have 6% of the Asian Development Bank. They have a relatively small number of the IMF and World Bank. They were banging at the door and says, we're rising, we want to contribute, as they've demonstrated at the United Nations. And they were given the cold shoulder. They're still trying to press their special drawing rights at the IMF, but at every turn they see themselves being blocked by the U.S., not only in the financial and political world, but also in physical terms when they start looking at issues surrounding the South China Sea, what they see as an encirclement campaign. So it's better that they're venting their frustrations by developing new institutions rather than reaching for gunboat diplomacy, as has so often happened in the past.
Anastasia, what do the other G20 members make of China's establishment of the AIIB?
I think they watch it with interest, but I think the predominant interpretation would be along the lines that these are regional projects, that this is an example of how globalization or post-globalization is now devolving to regional mechanisms, infrastructure projects clearly, but rather than multipolar or multi-level, more regionally based processes of integration, economic support, not political domination, but very pragmatic, practical, and territorially focused.
I know, how much of a risk to China and the G20 is this issue of regionalism on issues of trade and investment and protectionism?
Well, protectionism, xenophobia, all of these things are feeding into themselves. Once you have poor economic performance and people start saying they don't trust their leaders because they're not delivering, you start reverting back to this kind of right-wing conservatism, which is anti-everything. It's not reasoned. It's the same thing as with Brexit. There was a very emotional appeal to people's sense of these things. And this is the danger, because it's an ever decreasing spiral downwards as people's fears are, generate more changes in leadership rather than less, and there's no stability and no accountability going forward. Remember, business flourishes when they can calculate a stable return. You cannot do that when you have political unrest. So yes, China is definitely trying to seize the opportunity to create a much more stable environment than we currently have.
Okay, and regionalism, let's ask Anastasia, to what extent does regionalism make the WTO irrelevant? Does it matter?
It's a good question. In fact, there are various academic theories that would suggest that globalization is not through regionalism. Globalization is very much against regionalism. It's either or, it's not together. We may take different views on that, but there are some clear signs that the 21st century will actually be dominated by very large continental economies or markets. And they're not national markets. These are agglomeration of neighboring states that join together in some sort of formal or informal economic projects. And in this respect, the breakout of UK out of Europe is an interesting shift towards something new that could be either very beneficial if played well or extremely disastrous if not. So I would say that China, regional development banks and Asian Infrastructure Bank, these are all kind of first signs of something to be multiplied across continents, but under different regional settings. And it might well be that the idea of global institutions, universal approaches to doing things together, to universal free trade, is actually very much a yesteryear.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. Let's get back to G20 and the current summit. Einar, the G20 has proved to be most effective when it's in crisis management mode. What are the chances then, do you think, of it becoming a long-term governance mechanism, as China has indicated that it would like it to become?
Well, I mean, as we said, it's a long journey, but, the two things that you should be looking at. One, the ratification of the Paris Climate Accord just prior to this, the BRICS meetings, and then following in Xi's speech, he start pushing the vision further. As you pointed out, it's been a kind of case-by-case, year-by-year battle since 2009, but he started talking about aspirational goals of 2030. I think he's trying to shift the goalposts and make sure that people start seeing a longer vision. Whether they take it up, I don't know, but I think China is going to be leading by example rather than by dictate.
Anastasia, finally, are we likely to see, do you think, any important economic breakthroughs at this G20 summit?
Well, probably the most important breakthrough, although not economic, is the Paris Agreement that was just signed. In addition, it would be interesting to see if bilateral partnerships are signed or some sort of deals between emerging markets, or maybe between emerging markets and the Western economies. In fact, it was China and other BRIC economies that saved some of Western corporations back in 2008 out of bankruptcy. They provided the liquidity. I'm not sure whether emerging markets are in this position to do it now. They have been slowing down in their growth for the past few years. But I would agree with Einar that this is G20 is increasingly becoming the forum where big issues are being addressed and, if you want, enforced, because the detachment of global institutions or international economic institutions has been quite evident for the past few years.
Okay, there we must end our discussion. Thank you, both of you. I, for one, learnt a great deal. In Beijing, Einar Tangen, and in London, Anastasia Nesvetailova. And thank you, as always, for watching. Don't forget, you can see our programme again at any time just by going to the website. It's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on the issue of the G20, just go to our Facebook page. You'll find it at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And don't forget, You can also join the conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.